if you have declining production, consumption remaining reasonably steady, that points towards, the high price period that we've had over the last year or so, largely continuing, and certainly that comes through in the European Commission report. The projections are in the order of 80 to 90 cents ahead. So let's say the best part of a euro ahead of where they were previously. So yes, I think the high price situation is seen to continue in the coming years.
Hello and welcome to the Beef Edge, the Teagasc Beef podcast, for all your latest news, information and advice for Irish beef farmers. Over the last decade, the Irish agriculture and food sector has grown and developed and modernised. Teagasc has recently launched the Teagasc Enterprise Road Maps. Joining me to discuss the beef roadmap are Teagasc Head of Drystock Pearse Kelly and Beef Enterprise Leader Dr. Crosson at Teagasc Grange to discuss the current performance, market outlook, sustainability priorities and future targets. Paul, why is there a need for these series of enterprise-specific roadmaps?
The overall objectives of the roadmaps are to, I suppose, set out the current state of play of each sector, in this case the beef sector. So how do we think the sector, or based on the data we have available, how is the sector performing in terms of, physical performance, environmental performance, and most importantly, economic and profitability performance. So it's setting out that current state of play, and then looking at current, economic, social and policy drivers. Where do we think the sector is moving towards? So where will the sector be in 2030? And of course, there will be changes and there'll be a lot of volatility in that in intervening years. But we have to, I suppose, use the best data we have available to us to try and set out where we think the sector will be. And then the other element of the roadmaps are to, I suppose, identify what our high performance targets are. So, the early adopters, the high performance farms, the research farms, what level of performance is being achieved there? So what is the potential within the sector? Again, in terms of physical performance, environmental performance and profitability. And in doing so, we look at it within the Suckler sector and the dairy calf to beef sector. And the final element of that, Catherine, is to, based on the fact that we have a target that we wish to achieve for the sector, what are the challenges to achieving that target, and what specifically is Teagasc's role to address those challenges?
That's great, Paul. And Pearse, Paul mentioned there, Suckler element was very important as part of the roadmaps. Suckler cow numbers are declining. Is that trend likely to continue, do you think?
Okay, so yeah, if we look at the Suckler cow numbers over a kind of, say, the last 5 to 10 years, 100%, we've seen a significant decline in Suckler cow numbers, and there's lots of different reasons for that. If you go back, I think about 2 years ago, there was a significant drop in the number of calves born coming from the Suckler herd. That reduction continued in 2025. But if you stand back and look at it, kind of the December census figures are showing that seem to be bottoming out in terms of that decline in Suckler cow numbers. If you look at the calf births to date, coming from ICBF from the Suckler herd, they're ahead of last year. Some of that now is going to be because of maybe a better breeding season in 2025, leading to more calves being born earlier in 2026. So the time will tell if that's the case. And then the other, if you look at cow slaughterings. So cow slaughterings in factories to date in 2026 are back significantly. So that's Suckler and dairy cows, obviously. So all the signs is that we're probably getting to a stage where we're bottoming out in terms of that drop. And then you've crystal ball stuff, or anecdotally, we're hearing people are saying, with really good profitability levels in 2025 and likely to be repeated again in 2026. When you look at prices of beef and live animals being sold, suckling has turned the corner in terms of profitability. That would all indicate, that we've probably bottomed out in terms of that decline.
That's great, Pearse. And Paul mentioned there, the importance of monitoring performance. What are the key performance gaps between the average and the top performance Suckler herds?
On the suckling side, breeding performance is obviously hugely important in terms of the kind of key figures there: calves per cow per year, low calving interval. So they're key. I mean, you have to have a calf on the ground for a suckler herd to make a profit. And we see, it's in around 0.85 nationally, but in any average, there's farms there, and as the roadmap show, the top farms and the kind of top performing research herds are achieving in excess of 0.95, where there's a lot of other farms are considerably less than 0.8. So that's going to have a big impact. The other kind of key things that we see having a big impact on the performance is the age at first calving, especially on herds that retain their own heifers. So herds that retain their own heifers through from into their herd, if they calve them down at 2 years rather than 3 years, that's a significant difference in profitability as well. And then it's back to in terms of cow type and putting an emphasis on having a beefy cow that's producing, a heavy weanling, whether that weanling is going on for finishing on that farm or sold on further, that the breed of the cow and the type of bull that's being used and basically the genetics that's being used on the farm, there's quite a wide range in that across farms too. So there's lots of different things. And then grassland management, Catherine, and part of, that some of that is impacted by part of the country you're living in terms of grass utilization, and that under the last couple of years, that's not as big. We're seeing, some parts of the country getting as much rain as others now, but traditionally, some farms that have a very long winter, that's a very costly system on a suckler herd. So if they can shorten the winter and get more from grass, that definitely helps profitability.
And some small changes in any of those options that you mentioned there could have a huge impact going from the average to the top performing herds nationally.
Absolutely. It's a whole pile of little small things done right rather than one big thing having an impact.
Paul, with the export values strong, are reduced cattle supplies likely to support prices over the next few years, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I suppose, look, it's always very challenging to project what's going to happen in terms of prices. And I suppose what we can do is look towards some of the published data that has come out in recent months. So just before Christmas, we had the European Commission who put out their projections for all sectors of the agri-industry. And Pearse alluded to the suckler cow decline in Ireland, and I suppose that seems to be plateauing off a little bit. Looking at the projections from at the EU Commission level across Europe, the trends are that the decline in Europe is set to continue. And we should bear in mind that what happens outside of Ireland will have a much bigger impact on beef price in Ireland than any supply change and any production change within the country. We export in excess of 90% of production, so it happens, particularly in our European markets and our UK markets, will have a huge impact on prices. Putting all that together, and I suppose looking at the consumption side of the equation, consumption is going to remain reasonably steady, a very, very small decline, but essentially remaining steady in the intervening period. So if you have declining production, consumption remaining reasonably steady, that points towards, the high price scenarios that we've had, or the high price period that we've had over the last year or so, largely continuing, and certainly that comes true in the European Commission report. If I compare it with the report that they published almost exactly 12 months previously, the projections are in the order of 80 to 90 cents ahead. So let's say the best part of a euro ahead of where they were previously. So one with the other, yes, I think the high price situation is seen to continue in the coming years.
That's great to hear, Paul. Pearse, you mentioned there about the performance of the suckler herd. Currently, over 60% of the beef is now coming from the dairy beef. What impact do you think that's going to have at farm level?
Yeah, you're 100% right, Catherine. If we go back a number of years, 60% of the beef, the prime beef that we're producing in the country, was coming from the suckler herd and 40% from the dairy herd. But that's completely flipped to the opposite now, with the dairy herd since its quota removal in 2015 and expansion in the dairy herd, and the decline, as we already spoke about in the suckler herd. It now means that 60% is going to come from the dairy herd. So what that means really at farm level is that it's probably a new skill set for some farmers. So we see this out on farms. So we see people who weren't buying calves before are now buying a level of calves. We've seen some of those herds that were in suckling that have completely got out of suckling have moved into dairy calf to beef systems. We've seen other farms who Warren Suckling are now buying in runners or weanlings coming from dairy herds, say in the back end of the year. Um, and I suppose the big change with them is the breed type of animal that they're buying in. They're going back to a half dairy animal, and for the most part, the majority of those calves are early maturing, so Angus and Herefords, a lot of them on the ground. So they come into earlier slaughter weights at a younger age. So it's earlier slaughter, which does help in terms of emissions and that. Um, we're also seeing a change in profile in the calves coming from the dairy herd. Again, if you go back 3, 4 years ago, up to 3, 4 years ago, a significant proportion of calves coming from the dairy herd were dairy males, so Frisian bull calves. But with the advent of sex semen, that increase in year on year, we're seeing less and less dairy male bull calves coming from the dairy herd. So we're seeing a change in the mix of the breed of calves coming from the dairy herd. So again, more of those early maturing, and early maturing bulls and heifers. So they're two very different type animals from the point of view of the management of those and the slaughter age of those and the carcass weight of those. So there's a new skill set there for the people who are buying calves or buying those runners in terms of looking at the genetics of those calves, looking at the pricing of those calves, looking at the management of those calves and the slaughter age, and selecting for slaughter is a big thing, especially if they're being killed on farm from farms. They're especially with heifers coming from the dairy herd, early maturing heifers can get fat very, very quickly. So there's that level at farm level, Catherine.
I suppose that brings us on to kind of the emissions targets you mentioned there earlier, age at slaughter. Paul, in your opinion, are beef farmers realistically going to hit the 2030 emissions targets? Pearse mentioned there about earlier age at slaughter. Are farmers adopting the different technologies, like protected urea or low emission slurry spreading, etc., fast enough to realistically hit these emissions targets?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, and it comes up quite a bit, Catherine, in terms of the 2030 targets. Where are we, and are we going to meet our targets? I suppose the first thing to say is that there aren't specific sectoral targets, at least from regulatory and legislative point of view. The target is nationally, our national target to reduce emissions. We do have an agri sector target of in the order of 25%, but that isn't distilled down to the beef sector, dairy sector, tillage sector, and so on. So it's going to take a consolidated effort by all actors, if you like, within the agri-food sector to make a contribution towards meeting that national target. In terms of what we're doing in the beef sector, and if you look at protected urea and LESS, so low emission slurry spreading, I suppose it's important to bear in mind that we're coming from effectively zero when the targets were set in 2018. In terms of protected urea use, LESS use was very low at the time. The last year for which we have data, 2024, we had 28% of our chemical nitrogen as protected urea. And LESS use was greater than 40%. That was in 2024. So we can assume that both have increased again last year. So that is really, really a substantial change in a short period of time. And Pearse touched on, and you alluded to it there just in opening the question in terms of finishing age. And that's probably the number one measure that can be taken by farmers to reduce emissions. And we should look at it very much within the context of what can farmers do to improve profitability while at the same time reducing emissions. And reducing finishing age, or another way of looking at it, is improving live weight performance. And we saw the launch of the 10-point plan to improving live weight performance by Minister last week. And all of the measures within that are measures which will improve profitability on the farm while reducing emissions. It has, I suppose, if we look at the finishing age target, it has, or the level of performance has plateaued a little bit in recent years. We've had, a couple of really, really challenging years from the point of view of the weather that occurred in 23 and 24 and into 25. And that certainly hindered some of our ambition in terms of finishing age. But yet, if we look at it over the long term, certainly going back to 2010, we've taken almost 3 months off our steer finishing age. We've taken a couple of weeks off heifers, which are more challenging given that they are already finished earlier than heifers in the first, or than steers in the first instance. And we've taken about 3 weeks off young bulls. So we've made really, really good progress in terms of finishing age in the longer term albeit maybe in more recent years with challenging weather conditions that has stalled a little bit. So overall, I think if we put all the pieces together, I think very considerable steps have been taken by farmers around, improving performance of their animals so that they're finished earlier, adopting low emission slurry spreading technologies, and using much more protected urea than we would have in the past. So I think more can be done, certainly, but good progress has been made.
Most definitely, and I suppose Pearse had touched earlier on improving grass utilisation as one of the key things. Pearse, based on what Paul has said there, how can farmers improve grass utilisation without increasing costs on their farm to try hit these targets?
Yeah, so it's a key message that we're constantly, I suppose, beating that drum, Catherine, is that grass utilization has a huge impact on profitability out there on farms. And for a lot of beef farms, it probably comes back to infrastructure, having a look at the infrastructure that's currently there. So a lot of farms, very small changes to infrastructure, or even the number of grazing groups is something that we've seen over the years, that it costs nothing to double up a grazing group, rather than having 2 or 3 or 4 groups going around, having a reduced number of groups of animals, so that you're getting through grass quicker, you're taking out covers quicker, and you're moving around in a rotational system. So proper, without, I suppose, spending a huge amount of time talking about it, Catherine, proper improving, having a look at the grazing infrastructure, in even putting up simple reels and different things like that to try and increase the number of grazing paddocks per group, and reducing the number of groups on the farm. And that's little or no extra cost in that. After that, then there's other areas in terms of extra water trucks, lime, improving soil fertility, different things like that. There is a little bit of cost involved in those, but the return on investment on those is very, very quick. But if someone wanted to get out there this year in 2026, what I would say is focus on what infrastructure you have, and can you divide that up even with temporary reels, and reduce the number of grazing groups on the farm.
That's great, Pearse. And I suppose that kind of links into possibly improving labour long-term on farm, having less groups and improving the grazing infrastructure on the farm.
Yeah, it's a big one. It's a big key one. We stand back and we look at it. And we see farms sometimes, they're fragmented. That's not as easy sometimes for some people to do that, because they're operating across 3 or 4 blocks of ground. But yeah, 100%, yeah.
Paul, improving labour on farm and what Pearse has commented on there, and work-life balance, that was noticed as one of the key challenge in the roadmap. How could systems be simplified to reduce labour demand?
I think, and it's reflected in the roadmap in terms of our ambition and our focus on the challenges within the sector. Certainly, labour availability and work-life balance is a key challenge within the beef sector. Most of our farms are part-time. So most have some off-farm activity or off-farm employment. So, the availability of labour to engage in activities on the farm is obviously more challenging. We're I suppose the first thing to say is that we're trying to quantify this in a lot more detail in a labour study that's starting shortly. It's a number of years since we've really delved very deeply into this issue in terms of quantifying, what's happening across a very broad categorization of farms, and distilling that down to best practice on farms. In terms of technologies, look, there are a very, very large number of technologies that have been developed in recent years, and indeed many of them will be deployed already on farms. Heat detection technologies, calf feeding technologies, automatic calf feeders, and so on for dairy calf to beef systems. But also we've seen a lot more in terms of sharing simple improvements on farms. Things like handling facilities, penning facilities, and so on. We see a lot of these being shared on social media, on webinars and so on, and they have made a real difference to farms. I think the use of contractors, obviously there's a balance to be struck in terms of that, but certainly there are specialized skills available among contractors that make operating a farm much more feasible for part-time operations, and indeed full-time farmers, where the investment in machinery and equipment and so on can be very substantial. With modern equipment, so contractors can play a really important role there. But I would say probably the most important aspect of this, and Pearse touched on this, is having a simplified system. Compact calving in terms of a suckler system, or buying even batches of calves in calf to beef, or batches of animals if it's store cattle or whatever the case might be. Just in terms of again, Pearse described the simplification from a grass and management point of view. And if we extend that to general husbandry practices, disbudding, castration, vaccination, dosing, all of those practices, tend to occur at the same age/weight for groups of animals. So having even batches and being able to manage those in a much more simplified manner is probably the most important, it's not a technology, but it's the most important measure that a farmer can take, and if you have that compact calving, you have fewer groups of animals, it just simplifies everything to a much greater extent. And I think that's probably the number one measure that farmers can take.
I'll just ask both of you for a final comment before we wrap up. In your opinion, what will the average Irish beef farm look like in 2030? Paul, I'll come to you first.
That's a really, really challenging one, I suppose, Catherine. I suppose in some ways they mightn't look very different. 2030 isn't, it's not as far away maybe as we might think. I think you will certainly see much more adoption of the technologies that I just touched on. We already see that as the next generation comes through, much more familiarity with smartphone technology, with social media and so on. So sharing of information, adoption of those type of distance technologies, remote, virtual, we're looking to things like virtual fencing, I suppose, technologies like that are already, available and are already used in some countries, particularly where you have very extensive systems, drone technologies, again, already in use. We'll probably see much more of that. But I think if you walk into a farm, it mightn't look awfully different compared to what we see today. But just if you lift the bonnet, much more technology underpinning what the farmers are doing on a day-to-day basis.
That's great, Paul. And Pearse, in your opinion, what will the average Irish beef farm look like in 2030?
Yeah, I agree 100% with Paul there, Catherine. It's only 4 years away. I suppose what would we like to see happening? We'd like to see continue. We'd like to see the beef price continuing as it is. And Paul was saying earlier, all the signs are that we don't know we can't crystal ball it completely, but it's looking positive from a price point of view. That's going to hopefully give a little bit of confidence to the sector across both suckling and calf to beef systems. It's going to give a bit of confidence, hopefully, to farmers that that if they make good profits in 2025 and into 2026, that we're going to see a little bit of that money being reinvested back in farms, making farms more attractive, as we said earlier, for people to work on them, make them more attractive for part-time farmers, and making them safer to work on farms. And we're already seeing the green shoots of that happening out on farms. We talked to people who are manufacturers of crushes and safety systems and handling systems, and big interest in people are looking to draw down TAMS funding for handling facilities and that. So I suppose we'd like to see that trend continuing into 2030 to make those farms future-proof, so that they are more attractive for that next generation of farmers coming on.
Thanks very much, Pearse and Paul. I'll include the link for the Teagasc Beef 2030 roadmap in the podcast notes. That's all for this week's episode. You can catch up on all other shows and interviews from the Beef Edge podcast on the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie, or you can listen on Apple as well as Spotify. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe so you never miss a show. For all other updates from our beef programme, keep an eye on our Twitter and Facebook pages. Until next time, I'm Catherine Egan, and thanks for listening.